I'm going to sew the adorable Charm Patterns Hepburn top, and I'm wearing one right now. When I batch sewed a bunch of corduroy pants in a recent video, one of you said that now I should do it with tops since I keep saying that I need more tops. And that person was right, so that's what we're doing today. I love the Hepburn top pattern, and I'm going to make 3 of them for spring and summer. It has a lovely very 50s cut-on sleeve and a few different neckline and sleeve options. You know I love a band collar, so I'm going to do that again. I've made 2 of these in the past. This one actually I modified to have set-in sleeves, merging it with the Jennifer Lauren gable top, and I also made a black one with the cut-on sleeves as normal in ponte knit fabric. For today's version, I'm going to go short-sleeved. So these should basically be like t-shirts, but make them slightly more vintagey cute. So this pattern is meant for a fabric with about 10 to 25% stretch, and I'm going to use some cotton jersey fabric in my stash. They're kind of equivalent to a normal t-shirt weight. So my fabric is definitely stretchier than the pattern calls for, but it worked well enough for this version where I use the same type of fabric. I'd say the neckline holds its shape a little bit better in the ponte knit version and doesn't require ironing after laundering, but I'm happy to use up 3 fabrics from my stash, so I'm okay with it. I had kind of a random assortment of colors, not necessarily ideal, but here's how I narrowed it down. And it has to do with this stack right here. I went through my closet and pulled out some items that didn't have very many tops to match them. So here's what I landed with colors. I've got this bright orange jersey that will go really nicely with this pair of vintage cotton sateen capris. And then this bright yellow, which will go with this vintage skirt that otherwise has colors that are not very me, because I don't really wear a lot of purple. But this yellow will go great with this skirt. And then I have a pair of collective retro capris that I got in London several years ago. And this sort of strange shade of green for me, because I tend to prefer more like a Kelly green or a mint green. This is a dead ringer for the green and these pants. So these are the ones that I'm going to sew right now. And now I need to think about how I want to sew the main seams on these tops. Since there's some different options for knit fabrics and I'm batch sewing these, so I could use the serger or the sewing machine. So I'm going to sit for a minute and decide before I get started. And that brings me to today's video sponsor, Craftsy. If you ever wanted to learn new techniques like sewing with knits or just try out something new, then check out Craftsy. Craftsy is an online resource for all things creative with over 2,000 classes, plus an online community to ask questions, share projects, and get inspired. Their instructors guide you through step-by-step lessons on all sorts of topics from sewing to knitting to baking and more. I've learned some of my favorite sewing skills from Craftsy classes, like the amazing bra making series, which I go back to every time I sew a bra. If projects like this Hepburn top make you a little nervous, they have a subcategory of classes for sewing with knits to help demystify them. Knits 101 or the Ultimate Guide to Sewing with Knits would be great starting points or good technique refreshers for things like seam finishes. Right now I'm watching the Stable Knits part of the Next Level Knits class since I'm going to attempt my first ponte knit cigarette pants soon. The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. It's an amazing deal that gives you access to everything, including live stream tutorials and Q&A sessions. And if you take a Craftsy class that you love, let me know because I'm always looking for something new. Thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. So I think what I've decided is that I'm going to sew the oversleeve seams and the undersleeve / side seams with my serger because I can, so that differs from how the pattern is written. I kind of contemplated, there's just not that many seams on this. I kind of contemplated if I wanted to just sew each of these in order, but I think that I will be better served to batch sew this. So I will use a gray neutral thread in my serger to do those seams. And then I've got my matching threads, of course, and gray thread for my sewing machine as well. One of the things that I really like about this pattern is that she walks you through when to use a straight seam for seams that are not going to really stretch, like the bust darts and I think a couple of the other areas, and when to use a zigzag stitch. Obviously, I'll be switching to using my serger in a couple of places, but that's a really helpful part of this pattern. And I don't know, I think that means that I can probably get started. Oh, actually, wait, no, there's one more thing that I have to do. I traced off my pattern pieces when I sewed this originally, but I unhelpfully did not mark the short sleeve line. And that's what I want to use today. So I have to go back to the original pattern and mark that line so that I can cut my fabrics out on that line and then I can get started. So I thought everything would just sail along cutting out my fabrics, but here's the exact moment I unfolded my orange fabric and realized I had way less than I thought, and about the same of the yellow and not a whole lot more of the green either. Because apparently I just assumed I had enough for who knows what reason, and in fairness it would have all easily fit if I wasn't doing the band collar version, since the collar is curved and it takes up way more space than you realize. So cutting out was a real drag and mostly involved me trying to figure out if I could will these tops into fitting on my fabrics, so the idea of batch cutting it all was definitely out the window. I did at least discover that the green was the longest piece and a little bit over a yard, and I could just make it work on that. Welcome to where the cutting chaos is currently. I have the green one cut out, and I'm back to this orange fabric, stubbornly refusing to believe that I cannot fit this on this piece of fabric that I thought was longer than it is. So it really just doesn't look like I have enough fabric. But I had a thought, which was I consulted my black Ponte version and I consulted my sewing notebook, and I had written that I cut this about 2 inches shorter. And I think if I cut the pattern pieces 2 inches shorter, I can fit this band collar. I'm still kind of hesitant that I can fit it, but that's what I'm going to try next. I'm going to cut down the pattern pieces 2 inches, which I didn't realize that I didn't do on the pieces themselves, but after measuring compared to the French dart in here, I definitely cut off some excess at the end. So I'm going to do that. And as for the yellow, I think I have slightly more than this. If I can make it work for the orange, I should be able to make it work for the yellow. But what I did discover is, because I have a Jennifer Lauren gable top in yellow out of, I think this was maybe the leftovers. These are not exactly the same fabric, but if I need to, I can cut the under collar out of this fabric. They are almost exactly the same. No one will ever know the difference. And boy, we'll see if this is really the kicker though, this orange. So fingers crossed that 2 inches does the trick. So I figured I could make it work by cutting the pattern pieces shorter, and then maybe worst case scenario, if I couldn't, I could fit the outer band collar piece and then cut the under collar in 2 pieces and seam it in the middle since you wouldn't see it anyway. But turns out I didn't need to actually do that because I could just fit both collar pieces, and I mean just fit both collar pieces and the bodice pieces on the orange and yellow fabrics. Everything is cut out now. I managed to make it fit, which is excellent. What is much less excellent is the 2 boneheaded problems that I'm now going to have to work around, which I discovered along the way. First one is I just dumbed out when cutting out the orange because I was lazy and just folded up on the cutting line, and instead when I cut the back pieces, you will see that they have a much shorter sleeve section than the front piece. It is not supposed to look like this. It's supposed to look like this. So I'm going to have to cut off maybe about 1 inch on the orange one on the front pieces to match the back. It should be fine. Maybe I'll do a little bit of a narrower seam allowance for the sleeve hem. I don't remember what it actually is. It's stupid, but it's not a deal breaker. And then the other one, likewise not a deal breaker, but perhaps, I don't know, maybe a little bit more frustrating, is for some reason I went back to the time that I made the black Ponte knit version on my phone and found a little video in which I was talking about the fact that the French dart apex was about 1 inch too high on me, so that next time I was going to lower it. Did I actually do that from 2021 until now? No, I did not. So all of these are cut out with a French dart that is too high, and this isn't black fabric, so it will be a lot more noticeable. So I think I'm just gonna end the dart lower. This is a cut-on sleeve, kind of an easy fit. I think that will work. I'll probably baste one of them and try it, but I don't really have any other options at this point. So I think that's going to be how it's going to go, and I'm just going to have to deal with it. But at least neither of those things are going to prevent me from actually sewing these. But I'm sure not sewing them today because after all that, I just need to walk away. Sometimes that's just what you need to do when you're a little bit frustrated, is just walk away. So I'm going to come back to this another day. And it is indeed a new day, and I'm ready to finally start sewing these tops. I have my darts marked on each of these to try and shorten these about an inch or so. I realized my idea of basting isn't really going to work because in order to do that, then I need to either baste the side seams and put the whole thing together and try it on. And I don't really feel like doing that. So I think I'm just going to do the 1 inch shorter and call it a day and hope for the best because I don't really have very many alternatives other than that anyway. I could like maybe rotate it slightly as I go, but because of the cut of the French dart, that's not really going to be very easy anyway. So I'm just going to do it and call that good enough. I have shortened the sleeve area on the back of the orange pieces to match the mistakenly shorter sleeve area of the front on the orange one. So that will be slightly different from the others, but hopefully fine. I have interfaced the under collar, or maybe it's the over collar. I think it's the over collar on my band collar pieces. And in the process of all this, boy, I do actually think that all 3 of these fabrics, with the possible exception of the yellow, really are actually lighter weight jerseys than my coral long sleeve version. We'll see how this all works out. This, hopefully this isn't an ill-fated project idea, but you know me, I'm gonna try to make it work. The first step is sewing all the things that I can sew at the same time. So that's actually going to be stay stitching the neckline on the front and the back pieces. And then I'm going to sew the outer seam of the band collar. What else had I identified that I could do at this time? Oh, and then the bust darts. And I think that's as far as I can go in one batch of sewing things. And then I can start assembling once I have done that. I did the best I could trying to line up the darts after moving the apex down 1.25 inches. It's so silly because my fabric is stretchier than called for, so I don't even need bust darts. But since I'd already cut the fabric out and tried everything I could to rotate the darts out on the pattern pieces after the fact, to no avail of course, here I am sewing these stupid darts. By the way, I switched to peach as my neutral thread color since I realized that my gray serger thread was going to be too dark. All of these early steps are on my sewing machine with the peach neutral thread using my trusty walking foot, which for me is a must-have for sewing with knits. And after the stay stitching, darts, and outer collar edge were finished and pressed, it was time to start assembling the bodices. But first, I pressed up the hem edges on the bodices and sleeves. One of the Craftsy teachers calls this a memory crease, which I love. You've seen me do this a lot before. Anytime a hem will be fussy, I like to do this. It just helps things later when it comes time to hemming by giving the hemline a bit of memory. Okay, I have my 3 tops here and I am ready to start assembling the bodices. Now, the center back seam, you sew from the hem to this dot only. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a zigzag stitch on that. And then you're supposed to press the seam allowances open, which I'm not going to do because this green fabric is super curly anyway, so I think that would look bad. So I'm going to clip into the seam allowances and press it open above that because you'll need that for the way the band collar is assembled. And then I'm going to finish the raw edges on my serger. I don't really need to do that. I don't need to finish the raw edges at all, but because I'm going to assemble the side seams and the oversleeve seams on my serger, I figure it'll just look nice for consistency. So I'm going to go do that. So that was just the center back seam on the sewing machine, and the rest of the bodice assembly I could do on my serger. So that included finishing the center back seam and then the oversleeve and undersleeve seams on all 3. Just a little tip if you're using a serger to assemble this top like me, the cut-on sleeve is at a right angle to the side seam, so I just pull that into position as I serge, and that leaves a nice little curved underarm edge in the end. Okay, all 3 bodices are assembled, and here's what one of them looks like from the inside. And that's how I handled the top of the back neck, and I've got my side seams done, and I'm going to wait to do the hems, even though I could at this point before I finish the collar, because I might end up wanting to take the side seams in since my fabric is stretchier than called for. So I'll wait and do those at the very end. So that takes me back to my band collar, and here are my 3 band collars. I have the outer seam sewed. And now I need to trim and grade this seam allowance and then understitch this basically. So the interface side is the outer collar, the uninterfaced side is the under collar, and I will understitch towards that side the entire length, basically as far as I can get in the corners. And then you baste the collar shut before you pin it onto the bodice. And I remember from last time that center back junction, this one is inside out and looks all wrinkly because this has been laundered many times. This is really hard to get right. And I am not even sure that I really did get it right on either of mine. But I'm going to get it close enough and I'm going to do it 3 times. So I'll have plenty of time to practice. Grading and clipping curves, particularly for 3 things at a time, is a pain. And of course, I have nobody to blame but myself for that. I will say I got smarter as I went because on the first one, I clipped all of my notches separately, but by the second, I realized I could clip the first half of the triangle notch all going in one direction, then flip to the other side and finish them all going in the other direction, which was a way faster way to do it. So it's time to understitch. This is where I realized I was going to end up finishing these all individually so I could use matching thread from now on. I decided to understitch with my walking foot, which is not something I normally do. I usually use an edge stitch foot, but since my fabric is stretchier than called for, I thought it would help to not stretch out the collar edge too much. And it worked well. Just went nice and slow and steady. And don't worry if the collar looks a little wonky after you understitch it. Once you give it a good press, it'll lay nice and flat and look great. So it's time to attach the collar, and one thing that I should have done the first time, and I did it this time, is make a little sample of the back neckline and the collar intersection because I just couldn't quite figure out what I was supposed to do in the pattern when I attached this. And I think the fact is that I'm getting hung up, or I was getting hung up, on the language saying that the bands should overlap at the center back. Well, they overlap after you've sewed it, but they shouldn't overlap before you sew it because you can't really turn everything to the inside that way. So this is one of those seams that I have now realized because of my handy dandy little test job here, that you need to move one side out of the way when you sew the seam, and then when you approach it on the end, move the other side completely out of the way. And that way, when you turn this in, it just turns in perfectly and you'll be set up. You'll actually top stitch on the outside at the end, so you'll be set up to do your top stitching. This is not the way I did it the first time. I came up with something else that I didn't like as well. I think this will be great. And I don't know, maybe I'll overlap them and just do a little stitch in the ditch here or trim those back or something. I'm not exactly sure yet because I can't remember what you do to finish the seam allowances. But I'm very pleased at that little discovery, and all it took was me just making a teeny little test here. So I highly recommend that when you are not sure about how something will work, because you can just kind of play with it until you get it right. And I did this about 2-3 times until I hit on what I was supposed to be doing to make this work great, and I'm very pleased. And the collar went together great, with one exception, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see I have finished my yellow one. And ironically, I decided when I tried it on to cut another inch off of the hem, but otherwise I was happy with the fit. And I was also pretty happy with my on-the-fly adjustment for lowering the apex of the bust dart too. And here's what the collar looks like up close from the center back. Now you top stitch the collar about 1/4 inch from the seam line, and I actually decided to use a straight stitch for this instead of a zigzag because there's just not a lot of stretch in the collar. I think it's kind of overkill to do it with zigzag, so I'm actually going to assemble the collar and do the top stitching with a straight stitch on the other two. But anyway, I like to just taper it to the edge here so that this line of stitching where the top stitching meets at the center of the collar isn't further down. Just a personal little aesthetic preference, but I think that looks nice. It's a lot cleaner looking than my other ones before, which is why I decided to add a little bow to the back of my coral colored one. But I wanted to talk about one misstep that I made and had to fix so that if you're doing this, you don't make the same mistake. The under collar, because you understitch it, you're left with a little bit of extra fabric here as the turn of cloth. Now you'll need to trim that off when you do this, but I would recommend when you press to really make sure that that is folded up as flat and as far as it can go when you do trim off that excess, because I was not as accurate with that as I could have been. And so when I assembled this on the opposite side, I had a little bit of kind of like, I can't kind of emulate this, but a little bit of kind of bagginess of the undercollar. It didn't lay perfectly flat like this. And so I knew that was just gonna kind of make a wrinkle over time and maybe look bad after this was laundered. So highly recommend taking your time and making sure that this is really nice and flat and get off all that extra before you pin the collar on. So on to finishing the orange and then green one with matching thread now, after unpicking some of the zigzag stitches to fix the yellow collar, of course. If you were wondering, I didn't use fusible web in the hems in the end. Although it's not necessary, I tend to finish the raw edges of knit fabrics with my serger. I find that it often gives enough stability to the curly edges to tame things. But if I didn't have a serger, I'd probably use fusible web more often. So I just need to finish off the 5/8 inch hems with a zigzag stitch and my walking foot. For the green one, I did the hems first for some reason, and then the collar last. The only thing I'd do differently if I was batch sewing more of these in the future is I'd use matching thread for the center back seam, because you can see the last little stitch or two popping up at the top. At the end, I tried to cover that up a little bit with some hand sewing stitches. But making 3 of these tops was a really nice use for batch sewing because it gave me a few times to work out some things that'll help me in future versions. Because I love this top, so I definitely plan on filling in with some other colors. Decisions like, it turned out that I actually like 3 inches off the hem length. And when I tried on the orange one, I decided that I liked the accidentally shorter sleeves, so I cut 3/4 inches off the green sleeves. I'm really happy with how these all turned out, and I'm not mad at myself at all for using a lighter weight jersey because they look good and they feel good. They'll be perfect for spring and summer. And hopefully the collars will still look good after laundering, just a little bit more lived in. This time though, I promised to myself I will transfer all of my changes back to my pattern pieces, shorter darts included. So while I go do that, you can watch one of these 2 videos, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage-inspired sewing.